should just be starting. So first of all, let's give a big thanks to our two presenters, Jennifer and Shawna, who are going to present for us today. I've made them both co-hosts, so I'm going to get out of the way as quickly as possible and pass you over to them. If everyone can just make sure that your mics are muted, they're going to take questions at the end, so you can either write them up in the chat or save them for the end. We'll have a 5-minute Q&A session at the end. So no further ado, let's get started.
Great, thank you. Hello, everyone. We're honored to share our passion and research with you today, and we hope that we can continue to develop into a broader network and a tool for encouraging diversity and inclusions in our institutions and society. My name is Shawna Carroll, and I'm coming to this research from the position of a white queer woman and English speaker.
And I'm Jennifer Teeter, also a white English speaker and Jewish. And we both see it as our responsibility to use our privilege to generate continued systemic change. We share these positions to make note that we are implicated in systems of oppression as both oppressor and oppressed. But due to time restraints, we will quickly go through a lot of complex information, but hope you too will share any feedback and experiences in the question and answer at the end.
Can I just make one quick comment? Your face keeps disappearing from the screen there. I guess it might be to do to the light and the virtual background. You became invisible there for a moment.
So I know why. So I will, I think I solved the problem. Yeah, I won't disappear anymore. Thank you. So based on the first 2 years of an ongoing research initiative, we will share results from a survey that explained complicated conversations about oppression, including potential solutions to create socially just environments where all people feel included and valued. First, we will briefly discuss the particular historical context and related research related to our project. So since 1877, Japanese higher education has been strictly controlled by the government with the main purpose of graduating social elites. Post-World War II reforms allowed more access to other social classes. Nonetheless, economic and reputational drivers, as well as nationalism, are prioritized by the Ministry of Education. This is often at odds with practitioners who want to prioritize preparing students for the increasing complexities of global and local communities through inclusive education. Recently, there has been an emergence of research on diversity and inclusion in Japanese educational institutions. Watanabe 2017 and Fukada 2017 conclude that educators are aware of the importance and benefits of diversity inclusion, but hesitate to implement related activities. Yoshida's 2020 survey of education majors concludes that a deeper understanding of concepts needs to be fostered. While universities are implementing reforms to create more inclusive campuses, the policies enacted by the Ministry of Education are based on a deficit model, treating anyone who is not mainstream Japanese as a person who needs help. In terms of encouraging internationalization, Japanese and English language education are the priorities rather than equality and inclusion. For instance, the policies regarding people who identify as LGBTQ+ are antiquated and insulting, framing non-gender conformity as a disorder. This has direct reverberations in universities where a forced coming out of a student ended up in suicide, and the university not held culpable despite the student's repeated requests to change classes. Women are still underrepresented, with only a 3% increase in the number of female researchers over the past 10 years, 3%. This is directly linked to gender discrimination, as we saw with the scandal with Tokyo University Medical School female applicants who only received a maximum of 80 points out of 100, even if they answered all questions correctly on the exam. The research is still lacking on whether the voices of students are actually reaching stakeholders and being reflected in institutions, and there is no precedent for the results of climate surveys that include questions related to diversity and inclusion to be shared publicly.
In order to investigate student voices, we created a survey and enacted the coding process we'll explain later through our anti-oppressive framework using Sensoy and D'Angelo's explanation of the terms prejudice, discrimination, and oppression. Prejudice is a prejudgment about a social group that we have limited knowledge about, but the prejudice or prejudgment is learned and represents a person's internal thoughts, feelings, attitudes, and assumptions. Prejudice is a way of categorizing groups, but these categorizations are not neutral or unbiased. Discrimination is the actions or inactions that occur based on specific prejudices. For example, someone may ignore or exclude someone based on their prejudice, or they may bully or act violently towards them. Oppression is a system that allows one group to enforce its prejudice and discrimination against other groups because the former group has institutional power. For example, the rich male Japanese or heterosexual dominant groups hold power in Japan. Oppression is not based on individual thoughts or actions like prejudice and discrimination, but is based on the institutions that allow for domination, control, and imposition of the majority group's culture. As oppression is based on institutions and cultural systems, a person in the dominant group need not do anything to oppress the minority. The individual prejudice and discrimination is built into the society as a whole and becomes automatic, normalized, and taken for granted. One clear example of this is the women's right to vote. In Japan, women were only granted the right to vote by men, as men held the positions of power necessary to allow women to vote. Systems of oppression are often unnoticed by the dominant group, which makes equity-based solutions important. Equity pays attention to differing needs and circumstances, which are based on power hierarchies and historical injustices. Practices based on equality aim to treat everyone equally, expecting the same result, regardless of their unequal starting point. In order to achieve the end goal of equality, we must pay attention to unequal starting points through a lens of equity.
Maybe can you click the button one more time? Okay. So due to time constraints, we'll not explain the methodology in detail, but welcome any questions at the end, of course. We used a fixed mixed methods convergent design to understand students' experiences of accessibility and equity issues. 34% of the student body responded to 28 quantitative and 23 qualitative questions. We first analyzed the quantitative data to make conclusions in SPSS. Then we analyzed the qualitative data through our anti-oppressive framework using open and axial coding in vivo in order to understand the interconnections between the themes. The analysis showed that international students and/or Japanese as a second language students were more likely to be marginalized due to their race, ethnicity, gender, and sexuality. Although the general attitude towards the university was positive, analysis through cross-tabulations showed that those that were marginalized tended to have a less positive impression.
The first finding we're going to talk about is there is no problem. Many students explained that there is no problem of marginalization or that the university is doing enough. A student explained, quote, "I think it is good because with the atmosphere here and the teachers, people can spend their time here not worrying about gender," end quote. Another female student expressed that she had no problem due to her communication skills. This feeling that the student should have the skills to avoid marginalization, which focuses on the minorities rather than dominant groups' actions, was a worrying theme. When asked about race, students responded in similar ways, including, "I don't think there is anything particularly like discrimination," or, quote, "this enough is being done now," end quote. One student explained, quote, "Don't exaggerate when it's not a public problem," end quote. This individualizing of systemic issues is one of the greatest barriers to an equitable and accessible society. When people believe that oppression is individual, we ignore the ways we are complicit in the systems of oppression. The second theme we found was the feeling that we should not talk about or we should hide differences. When speaking about gender, some students spoke about hiding their gender identity or differences. One student explained, quote, "I have never talked to someone about my gender, so I never have thought I was marginalized. I thought I might be isolated if I came out," end quote. When speaking of sexuality, some students said things like, quote, "I never talk about that with anyone in the university." A few said they did speak about it, but one student explained he only tells people who understands his sexual expression, end quote. This hiding of minority sexualities is intimately connected to the heteropatriarchal society, which privileges cisgendered men and heterosexuality. When responding to racial or ethnic marginalization, one student explained, quote, "Don't think about it in order not to have prejudice. It is necessary to see people as a person and not see the other elements," end quote. As the minority group continues to be oppressed, this colorblind or identity ignorance approach ignores systemic oppression. Ignoring the barriers, advantages, and different starting points of groups allows the dominant group to continue to gain advantages. Next, we will explain findings of students' experiences of racial and ethnic discrimination. The first theme is connected to language. Language can be a site of both privilege and oppression. Although being fluent in English is highly sought after skill in Japan and gives one a lot of privilege, only speaking English can also be a reason for marginalization through othering, restricted opportunities, and, quote, social and epistemic exclusion, end quote. Some students felt isolated or excluded due to their Japanese language proficiency. One student reported, "I wasn't good at Japanese, so I asked the support department for support, and they told me to take a break from school and get my Japanese ability up." As universities in Japan continue to increase their international student numbers, it's necessary to offer resources to them so they can effectively navigate their post-secondary experience and the systemic barriers they face. Although we do not have the space to elaborate on mental health concerns, one female international student explained, quote, "I am depressed. I felt very alienated as a foreign student when I first came to the school and didn't have any friends in the first 2 years here, which also leads me to feel very unmotivated to go to classes in general," end quote. And when elaborating on these experiences, she explained, quote, "Some classmates are borderline racist without even noticing it themselves," end quote. One international student explained that, quote, "Many teachers discriminate against international students," and another explained, quote, "There are many Japanese students with prejudice and low awareness," end quote. Another international student explained, quote, "Everyday people look confused or terrified by the appearance of others like a foreigner, but these people exist no matter where you are in Japan," end quote. Although students and society share the idea that Japan does not have issues of racism, often comparing to the US, Japan does in fact have a long history of racism and specific anti-Chinese and anti-Korean racism. However, racism in Japan is still seen as exceptional. One international student complained about the university's lack of action against discrimination with regards to anti-Chinese discrimination. And another international student explained, quote, "There is also opposition to China. This caused me to panic. I felt threatened," end quote. One international student who reported, quote, "I have been insulted about comfort women and the Asahi flag, also despite the fact that it shouldn't be in a public space. The Asahi flag was painted by a student in one of their works of art, and they attached it to the wall in a hallway." Although the university swiftly dealt with this issue and the university president apologized and it led to an education initiative, these acts are based on a lack of understanding and can have a lasting impact. Although it was rare that students express overtly racist sentiments in the survey, one student said, quote, "Chinese and Korean people speak loudly during the lectures, so I want them to be more careful," end quote. And this speaking loudly is often attributed to Chinese and Korean people, and in contrast to positive views of loud Western people, especially English speakers. There's a strong preference for so-called Western, meaning white and from the West, immigrants, where white Westerners are seen as superior culturally and linguistically. And this Western privilege is seen in many aspects of Japan, so it's evident that it should also be within the university structure.
So moving on to recommendations, one of the most important themes we found was centering minority voices in structural change. Explained earlier, it's difficult for those in dominant positions to recognize or understand oppression, so it's crucial that we pay attention to marginalized voices. It is important, however, that we do not see marginalized people as the solution. When we look to those who are marginalized to solve the problem, it again individualizes the problem and absolves the dominant group's responsibility. Those in the dominant group must change their mindsets and behavior and allow structural changes to be made. Increasing students and staff's foreign language ability was a common recommendation. This also meant more language support within classes, for example, translating syllabi, putting subtitles on slides, increasing the number of interpreters, using simplified Japanese in class, as well as translating difficult to understand words in lectures. Students also recommended translations on signage in the cafeteria and campus announcements. Yeah. Thanks, Rob. And then another recommendation for international student support and student understanding was increasing the number of activities and events that promote interaction with Japanese and non-Japanese students. Many students recommend increasing education about oppression and diversity and mention topics of race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, religion, and mental health, both in lectures and at events like Open Campus. As those topics are relevant to all of us, it's important that conversations of oppression are not segregated into separate courses, but touched upon, quote unquote, in various classes. If students understand that they are all implicated in these systems from before birth, perhaps there could be less resistance and fear in being labeled racist, sexist, etc. If Japanese and non-Japanese or male and female names in the attendance are separated and sometimes written incorrectly, this sometimes translates into seating arrangements. Overall, staff and faculty should be trained to understand anti-oppressive teaching methods. The issue of staff training is connected to hiring practices. Hiring staff and faculty from minority identity groups was recommended by many of the students as a tool to create more understanding, but we also want to consider that this is also a way to change systemic oppression at the university. And in order to create a more accessible and equitable university campus, it's important to think about students with varying religions on campus. Several students recommended creating a building or a room where people can pray, including wash stations. It's also important to allow for praying at certain times of the day and other exceptions for religious circumstances. Students recommended that the university eliminate the gender column on the application for the university and other procedural documents. Having trans, non-binary, other, and prefer not to disclose options is also necessary to create space for diverse gender identifications. In addition to forms, it's important that there are enough accessible gender-free toilets, which was also recommended by several students. Recommendations for gender also connected to language. One common recommendation was to have teachers refrain from calling people by chan and kun, and only use san. In terms of mental health support, there were many ideas to help increase support for mental wellness, including creating a consultation email address so that anyone can consult anonymously, creating more opportunities to access mental health counselors, creating a support room with access to anonymous support, and creating more advertising around the available resources for mental health support. For physical accessibility, recommendations included accessibility of buses to and from campus and to and from buildings, installing elevators in buildings, ensuring automatic doors are installed, that there are accessible restrooms in each building, that smoking spaces are completely segregated or removed from campuses for those with respiratory issues, and that students have the support they need, such as note takers, as well as allowing for online classes. One of the most common recommendations throughout the survey was to make tuition cheaper. This was connected to international students' lack of opportunities for scholarships, but many students who are not international also explained that paying the tuition and additional school fees was difficult.
So in conclusion, we'd like to remind everyone that it's important for us to think about oppressive power hierarchies to understand the ways that students with marginalized identities, both Japanese and non-Japanese, require different kinds of support in order to create more equitable and accessible spaces. When there continues to be binaries and strong expectations for men versus women, Japanese versus non-Japanese, and so on, strong lines of exclusion perpetuate oppression and discrimination, especially for those that fall in between or outside of these binaries. The findings in this study show that the majority of the students within dominant identity categories feel that the university is doing a good job. However, those with minority identities are more likely to recognize the discrimination and call for change. When the dominant group does not recognize systemic oppression minorities face, it creates a strong barrier to enact change, as those in the dominant group have the power to change this systemic oppression or maintain the status quo. As this study was only the beginning of the conversation spanning a vast amount of issues, it's necessary to continue exploring these issues. And we hope this conversation will continue and allow for more explorations at other universities across Japan and other countries to explore these intersectional issues of systemic oppression for students. Thank you.
I guess we can open. Oh yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, we'd like to take questions, and also note, thank you, Rab, for noticing that I think your comment about the font is really good, because, you know, we are all learning and we all need to continue learning and doing better in so many issues with regards to accessibility and equity.
Well, it is a big tent and nobody knows everything, and we're all learning as we go. I mean, some of this stuff is fairly new, so I wouldn't sweat it. Okay, I think you guys wanted to open the floor up to questions. I didn't see any questions come up in the chat, so I guess that means people must have lots that they want to speak them instead. So.
And then just let me say, it's nice to see some familiar names, although I can't see your faces.
Well, no one's filling in the silence, so I can say something. I like the part where you said about having different language abilities on university websites. Because being a kind of techie, one of my annoying points is when you click on the other links and you see that the English page or the Chinese page bears no resemblance to the Japanese page. In fact, the worst one I saw was when you clicked on the English page and it redirected to a PDF.
Mm.
Oh gosh.
Yeah.
I think there's workarounds for that. I know that there's, because part of our research has been to interview stakeholders at other institutions, specifically about diversity and inclusion. And there is one university, I believe it was Tohoku University, where they actually have a professional interpreter in the office. I know that the university that I'm at, when I suggested this idea, at first they were like, no, but then I was able to slowly be like, you know, it's cheaper if we have someone here all the time. So it's really sad. You have to like focus on the economics of it, because it does take a lot of time. And then, you know, staff is limited, but it should be a priority, because that's going to make everything easier for everybody.
And Jen, there's a question in the chat box. Does your university have some committee for equity and support? How do you go about making these changes? For example, getting more gender neutral bathrooms?
Mm-hmm. Do you want to start, Shawna?
Well, for me, it's so hard because I'm so new and I'm not in the English department, so it's hard for me to know anything. I know more about your university than mine, I think.
Yeah, we have a center for diversity and inclusion that was opened 4 years ago by our president, Usubi Sako. That's been a big part of his agenda from prior to becoming university president even. And so we're working on issues like that, but we're moving forward. It's taking some time, especially now with the coronavirus situation. It's been really difficult to affect change and figure out what's going on, especially now, because I'm sure a lot of people are being marginalized, especially because of economic and other issues that we don't touch about too much in this presentation. But we talk about these issues in the campus, and then we have to, not in the campus, in the meetings, and then we have to present our recommendations to the Rijikai, the board of directors. And then depending on how they feel, they say yes or no. And I can tell you that, for example, there have been, I'm trying to figure out what I'm allowed to say. There have been issues that have been brought up to the board of directors by people, and then they're rejected for whatever reason, maybe an economic issue or it's not a priority. And then the person who have proposed those issues as a part of the center or just a member, even though our university is pretty progressive, they feel very disappointed, and then they feel like they can't rally for those issues anymore. So part of what our center is trying to do, at least with the people who are connected, is be like, look, just because we tried once, that doesn't mean we're going to fail. And for example, with the issue of getting childcare, for instance, we don't have it now, but we're trying to get more women in the universities, and there's more men we're taking care of children, but the substantial, I don't want to say burden, but the workload goes on women. So But as we get more female researchers in the institution, that's going to happen. As we get more people comfortable with expressing their gender identity, then there's going to be more push. So we need to like work on the structures and the systems that are not allowing for change to happen, I believe. Shawna, do you have? Oh, yeah.
We're done.
Yeah.
Just one quick point that you mentioned there. You said that, you know, when you kicked it up to the board of directors, it was turned down. And to me, that seems to be the real root of the problem, because university board of directors are probably the least diverse groups in the world. They're all old Japanese men, quite often conservative and bent as well. So, I mean, if they're the people who hold the keys to making the changes and they're not diverse in the slightest, to me, there's the root of your problem.
Yeah, but also I think, you know, people have the power to influence change, right? So if we, the people, are speaking up, we can fight against that type of oppression or lack of awareness.
We're a little bit over time. Do you guys want to have one last word before I turn off the camera and start preparing for the next session? Do any of you want to have a one last point?
Stephen Brown raised his hand.
Oh,
You're on mute, Steve.
Mute.
Steve, you need to unmute. You're still muted.
Sorry. I guess you've really run out of time. I just wanted to add a couple of comments to the how, which is not an easy thing. I agree completely with everything you've been saying. And I'm in kind of mid-management at my own university. And the thing about not giving up is really important. And there are people who want change, who are in positions of power. But one failure doesn't necessarily mean everything's completely rejected. I think you have to look at it as maybe one out of, say, half a dozen initiatives. And if 5 are passed, you're making progress. And I think you've got to really look long term and not lose heart at one failure. I know it's really, really difficult. I've been banging my head against the wall about several issues, but it's getting involved with the people at the top is I've found it's kind of easier to make change than that way than sit on the outside and throw stones. As satisfying as that is sometimes.
Yeah, no, yeah, also like being kind of having a, I don't want to say positive because that can be toxic, but trying to do, keep a positive attitude and the way that you present it, I think, instead of being, being like, wouldn't it be great if we did this because then this would happen? And then we'd have this. Kind of.
We are getting over time. Last comment. Shawna, do you want to make a last comment?
Thank you everyone for coming, and we really appreciate your interest, and we hope that you make changes in your own institutions.
Excellent. Okay. I'm going to start the recording now.
Thanks.